We have a speaker here this morning from the University of Iowa, a professor of political science, Professor Tim Hagle. He's come to speak to us several times in the past, and usually always about his field of expertise, which is politics. And there's certainly a lot of that happening these days, and in particular, the focus is on Iowa, with our status being in somewhat in limbo, and maybe we've toppled by now with the vote. Well, we'll see. But have your questions ready, and Professor Tim Hagle will share his insights on the political scene.
Well, I don't know about the insights. I'm going to gabble on for a while, I guess, but you'll have to decide for yourself how insightful it is. One of the things that I do, and I asked Chris about this, is rather than sort of have this talk prepared, because who knows what people are really interested in, which I can, of course, impose that stuff on my students. They don't have a choice to listen to whatever I have to say. But for you folks, it might be a little bit different. You'd rather say, well, this is really what I want to talk or hear you talk about or discuss or whatever it happens to be. And so I asked her some questions that you might have. So I do have some of those to start off with, if you'd like me to do that. Which kind of was a surprise, because to some extent we initially, when she contacted me, she said, well, can you come and talk about the midterms, because of things, lots of stuff was happening there, of course. And so I was thinking about that. Yeah, well, I've got all these numbers. I'm currently working on a bunch of papers that I usually update after each election, how Iowans voted and all this stuff. And I was thinking, yeah, I can lay all these numbers on these folks until their eyes glaze over, just like my students do. But I thought, no, maybe that's not such a good thing. But the questions that she sent me were a little bit different, kind of more general types of things. And so maybe I'll just kind of hit on a couple of those. Maybe those were your questions that you asked, submitted to her, and then just kind of go from there. I'd rather, usually when I talk to folks, and I'm used to talking to a lot of reporters, where they say, well, here's the general topic, and whatever questions they ask, and I can handle them if I can. If I can't handle them, then I tell them, okay, maybe you need to talk to another person. If I've got a name, I can give it to them. If not, oh well. So one of the things that kind of struck me about the questions is just sort of generally where we are in terms of partisanship, I think, is kind of the general way to think about it in this country. And one of the things that I often tell reporters is that we are in a period of hyper-partisanship. Now, I suppose it's all kind of relative, that it certainly seems like it's more partisan than it has been for a long time. But then I'm also aware of some of the stuff that was going on, in particular in the late 1800s, where things seemed to be very partisan at that time, especially some of the editorial cartooning was very vicious and so forth. But the difference, I suppose, is that these days we have social media of various sorts. I don't know the extent that you folks engage in that. I'm on Twitter, but I don't do any of the other things like Facebook and Snapchat and all that kind of stuff. But what that does is it pretty much means that this information, or whether it's true or false or whatever, it's somebody's point of view, gets out there very fast. And so it doesn't have that time to maybe folks to cool off a little bit, that the reactions are so immediate and so intense as a result, especially for a lot of younger folks, that it can be problematic, really. And I think that's part of what's causing our problem. But despite that, one of the questions that you hear a lot of people talk about, and one of the questions that folks ask is, well, sort of, is our democracy at risk? And I don't think so. I think that that's discussions along those lines are pretty much overblown. That's not to say that there aren't problems. There are always problems. But I don't think that they're so serious that we can't overcome them, because we're just basically still participating. We have to always be vigilant in terms of how we're letting our office holders of various sorts, whether it's the legislative branch or the executive or even the judicial branch, that we need to keep an eye, make sure that they're doing their job appropriately. Of course, what we think is appropriate may vary depending on your particular perspective. You may not always agree with what they're going to do, but the question is are they doing their job? And if not, then at least for some of those folks, we can vote them out of office. Not so much the judicial side of things at the federal level. Of course, in Iowa, we have the merit system for the judicial selection, so we do get that opportunity, but it's very rare that anybody is actually removed from office unless they've really messed up in some way or something else comes along. So I think we're really in pretty good shape, but again, it's always a matter of staying vigilant. And one of the questions, too, had to do with some of the challenges to our electoral process. And of course, things that happened in 2020 made a lot of people concerned in various ways. That one side is claiming, oh, there's stealing elections, voter fraud, and all of that. And the other side saying, no, it's conspiracy, all this kind of stuff. But at different times, both sides have claimed that elections were stolen, and not that far apart in terms of one election to the next. I don't think that we have to worry that much. But one of the things that I often talk about and mention to reporters, and my guess is looking around the room, many of you will probably be aware of this, is back in 2000. Election, what was going on down in Florida between Bush and Gore. That what I even told folks at that time when we were looking at that and saying, oh, there's this problem and there's this thing going on, and Democrats are trying to do this and Republicans are trying to do this. The thing is that there are always going to be weaknesses in the system, and for the most part, we don't notice them. That if you have a race that's going to be overwhelmingly for one party or the other, one candidate or the other, that you're not going to notice the problems that occur at the sort of the local level. And it's only when you put those problems under a microscope, like we did in Florida, where, okay, now we've got a problem here, problem on the ballot, problem how it's counting, how you look at this stuff. And that's when people start to get upset. Well, of course, in 2000, something like 600 and some votes determined who was going to be the president of the United States. So sometimes that stuff makes a difference, but we still have to be vigilant at other times as well. Keep an eye on folks and don't sort of let them get sloppy just because nobody's paying attention. And I think that as long as we're vigilant, as long as we're paying attention, as long as we're holding our office holders accountable, we're in pretty good shape. It won't always be easy, it won't always be smooth, but it's doable. And so in that sense, I'm not particularly worried about that. And usually, again, reporters, of course, who want to juice up the story a little bit, I'm always kind of a calm down kind of guy. Try not to get the feathers ruffled on this stuff. So that's kind of my perspective on that. Along similar lines, one of the questions that folks asked was having to do with that January 6th committee, and in particular, if this report was going to make much of a difference. And the short answer is no. And by and large, you haven't heard that much about it. Nothing really great came from it. And part of it was because it was more or less a show trial. And that's understandable. Democrats wanted to, make their point, but it was also a matter of trying to demonize Trump as much as possible. Well, certainly he deserved a lot of criticism for a variety of things, but on the other hand, trying to make it more than what it was problematic. And the Democrats made a big mistake by not allowing the Republicans to pick their people to be on the committee rather than handpicking a couple people who were decidedly anti-Trump. And so what it did was it made it seem like the committee was unfair and wasn't looking honestly at it, didn't have sort of the other point of view. And as a result, whatever they have to say is not that particularly important. Now, on the other hand, I see a hand up. I love the hands up kind of thing. On the other hand, if the Republicans decide to, and some have suggested they do this, continue or have their own committee and say, okay, you didn't get to hear the other side of this. Now let's look at the other side of it. And there are things people have been paying attention to, like, well, there are apparently something like 14,000 hours of body cam footage that hasn't been released yet. And so let's see what's going on there. And there's some alternate stories there. Now, nothing may come of it, but on the whole, I don't think there's going to be too much that we're worried about. It's I think for a lot of people, it's just let's get on with it. We got the president in office. Biden's in office. He's going to do what he's going to do in terms of running or not. So let's just move on. Now, to some extent, we can't do that because we may have a rematch of Trump and Biden in 2024. Maybe we'll want to talk about that too. But on the other hand, like I said, January 6th committee, at least as far as this report is concerned, I don't see much happening from it.
So it's true that the Republicans didn't get to handpick their members of that committee, but all the witnesses who were called were almost all Republicans. So the Republican side of the story was told by those witnesses, was it not?
It's sort of yes and no kind of a thing, because if by that argument that the two Republicans that were on the committee, Kinzinger and Cheney, that, okay, they're Republicans, so does that tell the Republican side of things? Not necessarily. And it depends on what questions you're asking, who you're bringing in. And again, the Republicans, other Republicans that if the majority leader or minority leader at the time, McCarthy, now the Speaker of the House, if he had gotten to choose who he wanted on the committee, they might have brought in different people as well. So, and of course, not all Republicans like Trump or like what he did or had concerns, and how you frame these sorts of things. And again, it's not a trial type of situation, which is always one of the problems that you have in congressional hearings. And we've seen this in a couple of other areas. My main area of research is judicial politics, so I follow the Supreme Court a lot. And so a lot of the nomination hearings. And one of the things I tell my students is what happened in the Clarence Thomas hearings and the accusations that occurred there. Well, part of the problem there that I tell my students this is that this wasn't a trial situation. You didn't have the same rules of evidence you would have in a trial. So there was a lot of hearsay, a lot of innuendo, a lot of gossipy stuff that became part of the record. Whether it was true or not, we don't know. It was maybe one person's perspective or point of view, and maybe they were being honest, maybe not. We don't know. And so you get that, unfortunately, in congressional hearings these days. So yes, there certainly were going to be some Republicans, members of the administration, that were concerned with what happened in various ways. But again, it wasn't a full sort of hearing that we might have gotten had there been a more balanced committee. Yeah.
So there were some things that were true about Trump that were wrong. And now he's saying he's going to run 2024. And of those things that he did wrong, I don't understand how he can run for president again.
Well, as far as
summarize what
I was thinking that. So given that they're not can hear the mic, so the question is, given some of the things that Trump did that were wrong, how can he run for president again? Well, the short answer is that the eligibility to run for president is pretty clear. It's in the Constitution. You have to be, 35 and all this sort of stuff. He hasn't been convicted of any crimes, hasn't actually been accused of any crimes yet. And so in terms of a legal perspective as to why he can run, there's nothing really preventing him yet. Now, that was one of the things that perhaps might have come out of the January 6th committee. In fact, they wanted to have some recommendations to the Department of Justice to charge him with something. But because it's so highly politicized, and again, that was part of the problem with the January 6th committee, is because they made it so politicized that anything that came out of it was going to have this basically be tainted by the politics of it, rather than saying, here we did an honest review of this, and clearly Trump committed some crimes, so we're going to pass this on to the DOJ, because of course Congress can't charge anybody with a crime. So unfortunately, again, because of the optics, if you like to use that word, some people don't like to use that word for it, but by looking so partisan, it made it very difficult for them to then say, yes, clearly Trump committed some crimes and DOJ should prosecute. If they prosecute, again, he could still run. But whether people would vote for him is another matter. So that's sort of opening up a whole new kettle of fish, because yes, he's declared his candidacy. We're still waiting to see what Biden's going to do, although I saw a poll, I don't know when the poll was taken, but I saw the report on it yesterday, where some 60% of even Democrats are not real keen on whether he should run again, or he'd have some sort of new generational sort of thing, which is the argument some Republicans are making as well. So we'll have to see what happens. But clearly that's the problem. And that's the thing that a lot of Republicans are concerned about too, is that they see Trump as being damaged goods. I mean, regardless of whether you think he did bad things or not, damaged goods, because Democrats did such a good job of sort of attacking him and undercutting him and so forth in the last election. And of course, some Democrats would like to have Trump run again because they think he would be a weaker candidate. They figure, well, Biden beat him once, can beat him again. Well, Biden didn't have a record to run on for in 2020. So we'll have to kind of see what happens. Ma'am.
In your opinion, whose responsibility is it to call checks on the government? Is it the press? Is there an office in the government supposed to do it? Is it the political parties? Who should be the real spokesperson for trying to make sure that they're doing the right thing?
So the question is, who basically should be keeping an eye on the government, keeping it in line and so forth? And the possibilities mentioned, the press, parts of the government, somebody else. Well, the first line of defense, I would say, are voters. that basically we have to be keeping an eye on this. Now, the problem, of course, is that we don't always have the information. We're getting our information from someplace else. So where are we getting it? The press. And again, where you're looking for that information may make a big difference, because one of the things we've also seen is that the press has become more partisan, perhaps. Now, again, whenever I say that, I always think back, okay, but that late 1800s, they were very partisan at the time. And so it does kind of vary, but we certainly know that, certain outlets, whether they're networks or cable outlets or something on the web, that they may have a particular point of view. And so they may be more or less likely to hold any particular administration accountable. One of the complaints that the conservative and Republican side had during Clinton administration, Obama administration, and now the Biden administration is that the press really isn't doing its job, that it's not questioning hard some of the stuff. Whereas when either the Bushes were in office or in particular Trump, you'd watch those daily press briefings and boy, they were hammering whoever it was that was the press secretary. So it varies a lot. And so you have to look for alternate sources to some extent. So you have to also then be careful, well, are those alternate sources reliable in terms of the information they're getting? So the press is good. It's certainly one, but you have to be careful there, not surprisingly. There are government offices that keep an eye on this stuff. There's usually an office, each sort of cabinet level department has an office of the Inspector General. I worked at the Department of Justice for a couple of years, and so we were always dealing with the Inspector General sorts of things and people from their office and making sure that our stuff that we were doing in our office was done appropriately. The office that I worked in mainly was the Office for Victims of Crime. And so we were sending a lot of money out to the states. So we had auditors in that were saying, okay, is this being appropriate? Are we making sure that they're giving us the right receipts, that we're reimbursing the states for the money that they're giving to crime victims, things of that nature? And so a lot of that goes on. One of the things that I would tell my public administration students when I came back is it seemed like we were spending $2 to make sure the third dollar was spent appropriately. A lot of bureaucracy, no surprise. And you think, well, is that a waste of money? Well, maybe, maybe not, because every once in a while then you hear about some huge waste that goes on. So all of the money that went out during the pandemic to try to keep a lot of businesses going, keep them in operation, that was not spent appropriately. It went to places where they didn't need it, or they were spending the money on other things, not on their employees. And so now we're probably going to have a lot of audits that deal with that. So my answer started with voters, but I would kind of say all the above in terms of all those things that you mentioned. Would say that those are important. Certainly.
The Electoral College, it's what we have. Is there a chance that it would ever not be what we have, or is that who we brought to the dance? And who benefits? Is there an identifiable demographic of who benefits from the Electoral College? I'm thinking it might be smaller states, but I don't even know why I think that. But it just fundamentally seems wrong that people win popular votes and lose elections.
Well,
And it's happened both directions, and I believe in history, has it not? You know what? I don't know.
yeah, I'm trying.
North Dakota, so you have to know, it's one of the very smallest states.
So the question is about the Electoral College and sort of, if I can paraphrase it, are we stuck with it? It's kind of the question. I'm in favor of the Electoral College, so I'll state that right up front. In fact, I've even got a T-shirt that says Electoral College on it, so I'm always tempted to wear it on Election Day just because, being
Could you tell me
political.
more about why you're in favor of it? Because I don't
Yeah,
know.
no, I will. So the idea behind the Electoral College, and if you aren't overly familiar with it, the idea here is that instead of basing who wins the presidency on the popular vote, the idea is that in the Electoral College that each state votes, and the winner of the popular vote in a state, the way it works now anyway, gets the votes that, or each state has number of votes equal to their number of congressional representatives, which means members of the House and the Senate. So for Iowa right now, we have 4 congressional districts plus the 2 senators, so we get 6 electoral votes. And so in that sense, it does reflect population in terms of bigger states like California and Florida and Texas, New York, although some of these states are actually losing some after the last census. And in fact, every 10 years, they do realign. And you may recall that we had 5 electoral vote or 5 congressional districts. So we had 7 electoral votes up until 2010. And if you look back far enough, there was a time when we had like 11 congressional districts, the good old days, right? But we are not growing as fast as many of the other states. And so we've been losing population. And by the way, it's likely we'll lose another congressional seat after the 2030 census too, just because we're growing so much more slowly. So the reason that I like it is that it's sort of a smoothing effect. It's not unlike the Senate, where again, a lot of people complain that, well, you know, you've got 2 senators that represent 50 million people, I think it is, in California, and you've got 2 senators that represent 500,000 people in Wyoming, which is the least populous state. That doesn't seem fair. Well, okay, at least in terms of a numbers sort of thing. And they'll say, oh, is it democracy? Well, what we've got, we don't have a direct democracy here. What we have is a constitutional republic. So that's kind of the academic sort of way that people deal with this. But the idea is that you want to make sure that the smaller states have their say too. And this was a big concern, you know, way back in the late 1700s, because you had some bigger states, some smaller states, and there were concerns that if you were just basing it on population, that the bigger states would dominate. And that would be true today too. That, you know, California, which may be much more progressive, let's say, than many other states, would be able to exert its will perhaps on other states that even are nearby to it, Idaho, Utah, and so forth, that are more conservative. And that, in a sense, doesn't seem fair. And so one of the things, and we've even seen this in Supreme Court decisions, where you get that opportunity to, at a more local level, rather than national level, a more local level, although you don't usually think of states as being local, you get them to make their own decisions about things, or at least have a say or have a bit more say. But of course, in the House of Representatives, then they have, you know, that population does have a greater effect. In terms of just the general idea, in fact, there is a movement, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now, National Popular Vote, I think is something close to the name, where some states have in fact voted to say, well, what we're going to do is we'll have our electoral votes go to whoever wins the national popular vote, regardless of who wins in our state. And if enough states do that, then that could swing it in a particular way. But it's mostly states that tend to be blue states, meaning dominated by Democrats, that tend to have voted that way, rather than some bigger states too, New York and I think some others. Although not all big states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, they aren't huge. And more smaller states tend to not particularly like it, not surprisingly, because it would mean that they would basically be out of luck. And it's certainly true. And we saw this in terms of one party winning the popular vote but not winning the electoral college. You know, and even to some extent, we can bring that back to Iowa in particular, because we get a little bit of that here. We don't have an electoral college type of situation, but what we have is a situation where the Democrats in Iowa tend to be more concentrated in a handful of counties. Johnson County, for one, where Democrats have a majority, outright majority over Republicans and no party voters combined. In fact, their advantage over Republicans is over 2-1 at this point. Polk, Lynn, Scott, Story County is another one, you know, the ones you kind of suspect. And as a result, they get a very high concentration when you win. It's very hard for Republicans to, well, it's almost impossible for Republicans to win in Johnson County. But what that means then is that in other places throughout the state, Democrats aren't as competitive because they're all concentrated in these areas. And that's the same sort of thing where you talk about Hillary Clinton beat Trump by 3 million votes, roughly, is what it was. And all 3 million of those votes, you can sort of say, came from California, because that's how her margin of victory there, whereas everything else in the rest of the country is much more even. Well, that's kind of a fun, people will say, yeah, but you can't really do it that way. You're true. But the point is that because one party dominates that particular state so much, that you're asking, well, does that mean that we should be able to enforce their will on the other states? And, you know, some people will say, yes. I tend to be on the no side, just again, and you were right. That's, I think, more than anything else, is to protect the smaller states so that they don't have to abide by something that they disagree with. It doesn't necessarily fit whatever it is that that their interests are.
I think it's related. Gerrymandering, as we have these different districts, how much does that affect the results of, and how cynical should I be about gerrymandering?
So the question is about gerrymandering and how it affects the results and whether we should be cynical about it. Fortunately, here in Iowa, we don't have to worry about that because we don't have gerrymandering in that sense. That under law, and oddly enough, I wrote a chapter in a book on this for the 2010 census and redistricting because we had lost a seat. And so some political scientists from another place put together a book for all the places that were losing seats. And well, what do you think about this? So under Iowa law, the folks, the nonpartisan folks that put together the districts, the proposed districts, of course, the legislature has to vote on it. They can't take into consideration the party demographic, what the relationship between Republicans and Democrats is, and no party voters in any particular district. They can't take into consideration where any office holders live, so they can't protect seats. And they do have to be cognizant of, at least at the congressional district level, they have to be cognizant of county lines. You can't split counties. You can split them for House and Senate districts, but not the congressional districts. And so with those sorts of things in mind, and they, again, other rules in terms of making sure that the population is as evenly as possible, split as possible between the congressional districts as well as the state House and state Senate, that they go ahead and do their thing. Now, once the Legislative Services Bureau puts its proposal out, the legislature gets to talk about it, the parties get to talk about it. They have a commission that goes around to get public input on it, as they did this last time around, and you can weigh in on it. And one of the things that we've often seen is that you'll have office holders that are thrown together. And in fact, there was a situation recently where there were 3 office holders that were put into the same House district, I think it was. And they either have to move or they have to have a primary against themselves or whatever it happens to be, because they were all the same party. And then sometimes you have incumbents go against each other. And we've had that happen at the congressional level here not all that long ago. So for us, the gerrymandering part of it doesn't affect us. And I always tell reporters when they ask about this, I think it's good because it shakes things up. Because you get some people that retire rather than have to go through this stuff again. You get other people that come in, challenge it. Maybe they have to move, maybe not. I guess if they have to move, then it helps the real estate market. You look for the silver lining, right? So in that sense, it's good for us. Now, other states, of course, we do know that they do gerrymander. And that's up to them as long as they're within constitutional rules in terms of population can't be too different, but they can have very strange looking kinds of things. And in fact, there are even some federal requirements for gerrymandering that a few states, because of discrimination in the past, have required what are called minority-majority districts, where they have a district that's fashioned in such a way that a majority of the people in that district are of a particular minority group, blacks or Hispanics, depending on. Texas has got some Hispanic ones, some of the other states in terms of blacks. And so as a result, you will have very odd shaped districts just because they have a bigger goal in mind. But gerrymandering happens, and we do see it from other states, and not to pick on any states, Illinois, but it does happen. And that's one of the things that I wouldn't worry. You asked about worrying about it. I'm not too worried about it because it does, like I say, they do have to abide by federal constitutional requirements. But, if you have one party that dominates it, they're probably going to try to advantage their party. And actually, California is another example of this. And the way California have been doing it is that the Republicans and Democrats would get together and they say, okay, well, let's draw this seat that's safe for this person who's very powerful, and this one that's on the other team very powerful. And so they do kind of protect certain people. And like I say, in Iowa, we don't have to worry about that. Nobody's really protected. And we have had instances where even members of Congress have been thrown together in contests.
So I like Iowa. That's just what you say. Iowa, seems to me everybody should do what I was doing, but we don't have the authority to tell them that.
Right. Exactly. Well, I like what I was doing. I'm sure the other states, if you're the majority party, you like what you're doing too, because your party is in control. But again, in Iowa, it does sort of make it more competitive in various ways. Sir.
there a better way to prevent future presidential candidates from falsely claiming they won the election when it was clear they did not?
So the question is there a way to prevent future presidential candidates from claiming they won the election when they clearly did not? The short answer is no. The question, though, would be how clear it is. Now, assume you're thinking of 2020, for a lot of people, it was very clear who won, and it was Biden. But for other folks, there were these things where we have questions. And again, it's back to what I was saying about, well, once you put the system under a microscope, all of a sudden people are starting to ask a lot of questions. Why are you doing it that way? Why aren't you letting the observers in there? Why is these numbers mysteriously changing overnight when there was nobody working on them? So you get these things and people ask questions and, kind of it spins out of control a little bit. Basically, it's again a matter of trying to make sure that you have people that are doing an honest job of observing this stuff. And I don't mean necessarily the actual electoral observers, although maybe some of you have actually worked on that in polls and so forth. But in terms of the press in particular and members of each party that you have, one of the things, just quick aside, is in the caucuses, one of the things that happens is that usually when you're counting up the votes on that night, you've got representatives of each candidates that's there verifying, yes, this is counted correctly, yes, you're entering the numbers correctly. So you have people verifying this stuff. But, at a general level, there's nothing really to prevent somebody from going off. And the question is, and making false claims, you're probably thinking of Trump, but I think of Stacey Abrams down in Georgia, who refused to admit that she lost the governor's race to Kemp a number of years ago. Not this most recent one, but 4 years earlier. And just never did it. Now, she's not making a lot of national news about that because, Governor of Georgia, we don't care as much nationally. Certainly in Georgia, they care. But she certainly was using that as a thing to kind of keep her in the news. And she ended up, of course, running again and losing again. But people can say whatever they want. It's just that we have to have enough information, and that's the key, is having that information to know whether any claims along those lines are legitimate or not. And hopefully is clear, and that's the key word, I guess.
Yeah, I was wondering, I mean, we have this huge political, socioeconomic, cultural divide. And I'm just wondering, it seems to me in this state and a lot of things are being pushed through by, if you would have a referendum, would probably lose, like our school changes and how they're funded in books and so on and so forth. The question is, would not a parliamentary system, or at least more active parties, serve us better to pull that cultural political divide together at this time and age?
The question here, and let me know if I don't paraphrase it right. Basically, we've got a situation where we have a divide in this country, not necessarily just the political divide, but cultural, socioeconomic, these other sorts of things, which kind of go along partisan lines in many ways, but not always. But the point is that some things perhaps get passed by legislatures, let's say, I'll pick on them first, that would not necessarily be approved of if it was put to a vote in that sense. I'm going to stay away from the parliamentary aspect to it. I don't really deal too much with that, except I do like the questions part. That's always entertaining when they have that. Well, that's sort of where we're at. I mean, we elect our representatives to basically do this. And of course, here in Iowa, we're in a situation where Republicans control the governor's office in both legislative chambers in fairly large margins at this point. And so that's what the people in Iowa have voted to have done. Now, again, different spots where Democrats are more numerous, Johnson County, Polk, and the counties I mentioned before, probably are not real keen on that, or Democrats generally, wherever they happen to be. And that's fine. And so they can make the argument, hopefully, against it, and against whatever it is that's being proposed. And if people don't like it, and can convince enough other people to like it, then that's when you challenge people down the road. You know, have somebody that's going to be a good challenger on the other side of the other party, or even primary people. We had that happen a number of times where a number of Republicans were primaried simply because they disagreed with Governor Reynolds and what she wanted to do. Well, that's how it works. We do that. We have that process. Sometimes it takes time. But it's not just the legislature that happens. And the nice thing about when it's the legislature that happens is, again, we have that opportunity to vote them out of office. And for the House, even the State House, it's every 2 years. The Senate in Iowa, it's 4 years. At the congressional level, it's 2 and 6. For Republicans, of course, it's every 4 years. But you do have instances where the executive will sometimes do things that maybe couldn't get through the legislative branch. And we're seeing that potentially at the national level. So we're at a point where we have a divided government again. Republicans control narrowly, but control the House. Democrats, again, narrowly control the Senate. Will anything get through? Well, some might argue that maybe it's a good thing that nothing gets through, because sometimes it keeps them from making too much mischief. But on the other hand, when Obama had the same situation with a divided government, he says, well, I've got a pen and a phone. And the pen was the more important part because he would sign executive orders. So he was making great use of those. Well, the problem with that was then when the next party is in office, you set the precedent, and now you all of a sudden, in that case, you had Trump maybe making some executive orders, or now it's Biden or whoever is going to be the next time. And so you have to be careful about giving that executive too much power. You'd rather have the legislature doing it. And along those lines, you also have the courts doing it. And in fact, on your question, one of the things that came up was Iowa Supreme Court, of course, was one of the first to recognize same-sex marriage. And the Democrats in the state legislature, as I understand it, were reluctant to allow the people of Iowa to have that go to a vote, to let the people vote and say, yes, we want to have our state approve this. They wanted to have the courts do it. And that's not an unusual strategy. That to some extent, even as far back as the 1950s with the civil rights movement, Thurgood Marshall, as the attorney, one of the attorneys, probably the most famous attorney for the National Association, NAACP, basically they were not having any luck changing discriminatory laws in state legislatures, especially in the South, no surprise in the 50s. So they went to the courts and eventually found success there. And through a number of cases in the late 30s and then into the 50s, with, of course, Brown versus Board of Education being extremely famous one, that they got the court to say, okay, this is segregation of public schools is unconstitutional. And then it went from there and expanded from that point. But they couldn't do it in the legislature. So there are times when, you know, for good or bad, Brown versus Board of Education was good, obviously, but maybe other times you don't think they're so good, that you have these unelected folks at the federal level, at least, or even if it's state judges who rarely face that. Now, in Iowa, there were 3 Supreme Court justices that were removed, which was incredible. I happened to be doing a election night commentary for one of the local TV stations, and I was watching these numbers go across the screen, and they were all paying attention to the legislative and executive things, and I'm watching the judicial thing, saying this is really groundbreaking. We haven't had anybody that's been removed, especially at that high level, basically ever since we've been under the merit system. So let me kind of bring it back. I know I tend to drift sometimes on these questions, but the point is that basically it's up to us to keep an eye on this. And we'd rather have the legislature doing that because we've got a little bit better to say and do that. Now, we also have the opportunity in some places to get things ourselves on the ballot. If we don't like it, try to get it on as a ballot measure in some places. California has, I shouldn't say easy because you've got to get an awful lot of signatures, but they've got a very kind of regular way of getting things on the ballot that people don't like it. Let's put it on the ballot and take care of it. There, you had your hand up.
Back to the electoral college, aren't there 1 or 2 states that divide their representatives at the electoral college based on the voting state?
Yeah, the question is, there are a couple of states. Normally, the way the electoral college works is that you have as I was saying, all of the votes, the electoral votes, go to whoever wins that state's popular vote. But the question was that there are a couple of states that, in fact, don't do it that way, that they divide it. And they divide it by their congressional district. So whoever wins a particular congressional district gets that district's vote. Nebraska is one. I think Maine is the other one that does that. Although I did see a news report suggesting that that Nebraska wants to change it, and I didn't see what they wanted to change it to, but possibly so that it was more in line with, you know, whatever, because normally you would have a situation where one of those congressional districts in Nebraska would tend to be more for the Democrat, and where the rest of the state would go Republican. So I could see where a Republican legislature might want to try to change that.
My question is, we have the establishment clause in the federal constitution and in our state constitution to prevent theocracies from occurring. We know how those work over at East. My concern is, do you think that there's going to be a lawsuit, state of Iowa, or the House of Representatives and Senate voting on a bill that basically is going to violate the establishment clause by having tax dollars go to Christian schools? I think that's likely.
The question has to do with whether the new law that's been passed in Iowa to provide money for private schools, many of which would be religious in nature, violates the establishment clause of either the federal or the state constitution. And boy, this is like right up my alley, because this is one of the things that I teach my students. One of my classes is an undergraduate constitutional law course. And one of the things that made me unhappy last summer was Supreme Court issuing a bunch of decisions that made me had to make major changes in the course pack that I use. It's all these new cases, and it's like spending summer editing and reading these things. And one of the areas that I emphasize to my students is establishment of religion. We deal with a lot of cases dealing with the school thing. And the short answer is, it looks to be, now it's not to say it's going to prevent a lawsuit, because again, as I tell my students, you can always sue. The question is, can you actually win? I think they're probably okay as I read the law, simply because the way the Supreme Court's, the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions have gone on this is that as long as the money is going to students in a particular way, rather than to the school directly, that it's okay. And as long as it doesn't seem to advantage the schools that have a religious nature, that basically that it's a parent's choice. And so even to the extent that, and I don't know what the percentage here is in Iowa, but even if you have like 90% of the private schools happen to have a religious background, that's not going to disqualify a program. It's more a matter, again, of whether or not it's the parent's choice to say, hey, I want to send my kid to a private school, and it's my choice, and I'm not pushed into sending my child to a religious-oriented private school. So as long as those things are satisfied, the law is probably going to be okay, because that was one of the first things I thought of when I was looking at this as well. Follow up.
That's crazy. I mean, if the state dollars are going to you can use that shell of the family decision as exclusive. But if the state dollars are going to a Christian or Islam, I don't care what religion, I mean, that's just double talk.
Wow.
There was a case long, long ago that I used to teach in my class, but has been superseded by others, that basically made that point, that what was happening was a state, and I don't recall what state it was, I want to say Pennsylvania, but I'm not sure, that was giving textbooks, it was buying textbooks, and said, well, we want all of the students in our state to have the same textbook, regardless of whether they're going to a public school or a private school, and many, again, private schools were religious oriented. The problem that when it got to the Supreme Court, though, they said this is a sham simply because you're giving the books to the schools. You're not giving them directly to the students. And so you're basically making your point, which is that they weren't buying it. But cases since then, again, the court has now got its sort of little test that it looks at and says, well, is it basically a choice on the part of the parent? And, you know, the parent may live in a place where you've got a lot of non-religious private schools, may live in a place where you don't have that choice, but you still don't want to send your child to a public school. So as long as you're doing that, at least as far as the court is concerned, you're not violating the establishment clause. Now, having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean that as voters, you have to approve it. So if you want to push back on that, talk to your legislators and so forth, and that's sort of the approach you're gonna, and then over here.
So, a comment, in 1965, the Iowa legislature passed legislation that provided grants for kids to go to college. I was at Luther College. I get a call from the financial aid office saying there's this new program. Those grants all went to individual students. The legislative thought was less costly to fund higher education by using existing institutions rather than funding University of Iowa, Iowa State. So there's precedent for supporting students going to private schools.
Sure. There are some differences as to how the U.S. Supreme Court deals with the college age group versus K-12. But yeah, that's basically an example of that.
To go on the same theme, many churches, including ours, took PPP money during COVID to help pay staff. Assume, the church was closed, giving may be down. How did you feel about that? Or did you know about that? Because that put a huge list of all Eastern Iowa churches that took money. And I didn't know if you had feelings on that from federal money.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that particularly. And again, it's one of those things where what you've got here is you've got two clauses. We're kind of talking about I should have repeated the question first, basically that some churches got PPP money during the pandemic. And the question is maybe that was problematic. The two clauses that we have to worry about, and one we're talking about right now is the Establishment Clause. And you're probably all familiar with that in the sense of, well, basically you can't have public tax money go for private religious purposes. But on the other hand, you've also got the Free Exercise Clause. And we think about that in terms of, well, it basically means that you can practice whatever religion you want, maybe with some limitations of various sorts. But what it also means, and the court has sort of looked at that when they've sort of been trying to deal with both of these clauses together, is that not only does it mean that you can practice your religion, but you can't be excluded from things that would be public benefits more generally. And that PPP is kind of a good example. Education perhaps is another, in the sense that, well, we're going to give money to students, we're going to give money to businesses or people that have employees. Oh, but we're not going to give it to you folks because you're religious. Now you violated the Free Exercise Clause of the Constitution. And so that's where you have this kind of conflict, a tension between the two. And the Supreme Court, at least, has sort of tried to sort this out with some recent cases.
Comment on money in politics, and I'm thinking of like Citizens United, where corporations count as like a person. And also they talk about dark money, where sometimes candidates don't have to say who funded their campaign, and it could be some foreign actor.
Sure. So we're now going to talk about maybe money in politics. Citizens United, famous case, infamous as far as some are concerned, was mentioned. Also the idea of dark money, where you don't have to tell where your money is coming from. As far as the dark money side of things goes, and I'll say that money is considered, again, by the Supreme Court as a form of free speech. And maybe I can't always speak, but I will give my money to somebody who can maybe pool it with other folks, and they can speak on my behalf on whatever issue it happens to be, something environmental, something societal, whatever it happens to be. That's how I'm giving my speech in that sense. And so with dark money, the concern there is that, and we've seen this today with, and even more so today, with the idea of cancel culture. And the idea that maybe I can give some money to somebody, but if somebody sees my name on a donor list, then they're going to come back and attack me. And I don't want that. I want to be able to sort of give my money to somebody who's willing to speak, even though I'm not, but I like what they have to say. And that's kind of the idea behind it. Now, the problem, of course, is if it becomes abused, that you have maybe shady characters, big donors giving huge amounts of money, and you're not sure, what's driving this, what's the idea behind it, why are you giving this money? So in that sense, we'd like to know. But again, you've got that tension between the two things, that you want to have maybe a certain amount of anonymity, but on the other hand, and also a certain amount of accountability as well. And that kind of drifts into the idea as to whether maybe corporations in particular can give money to things. And one of the things, you may recall this from a number of years ago when Mitt Romney showed up at the soapbox for the Des Moines Register at the Iowa State Fair, and he said that corporations are people. Remember that one? Got a lot of trouble for that one. I thought I was perfectly okay. They are, yeah. Why is this all of a sudden a big deal? Because part of my background is I went to law school. I was a lawyer, and they tell us in law school corporations are treated as people, that they can be sued and sue just like every other person. Okay, so when Romney said that, it didn't even faze me until there was this big backlash on it. But the point is that, yeah, they can to some extent represent their interests. They have business interests too, not just as necessarily individuals. Of course, they may also have a whole lot of money if they're a big corporation. And so now you're talking about flooding the zone, so to speak, in terms of how much money is given and what the limitations are. But they basically have that opportunity too. And the thing about even Citizens United, I would say, and I'm real strong in terms of free speech stuff. And so I don't like a lot of the stuff that goes on these days in terms of trying to, limit people's speech. I think there are other ways to do that. In particular, given that I'm a teacher, education is being the way, or more speech on the other side. And so that's sort of the way that I would say is that, well, if one corporation can do it, the other corporation for the other side can do it too. And that's kind of the whole thing. So I think I'm not real keen on the whole concern over Citizens United. I wouldn't worry about that so much because on both sides can pour in money as much as they want. And we certainly see lots of money in terms of that. Sir.
Just to the question of what happened to Iowa in 2000, we elected Obama twice, we voted for Obama twice. All of a sudden, Iowa is a solidly red state. What happened?
That's a good question. I love that question. And I'm looking at the clock here, and it looks like this might be the last one. So since it's getting close to time, so good one to end on. So the question is what happened in Iowa that we went for Obama twice in 08 and 12, and then all of a sudden Trump twice, and are we a red state now? And I get a lot of reporters will ask me that, say, well, Iowa's a red state. And I say, nope, hold it. Put the brakes on right there. I still say that we're a purple state. We're not red, we're not blue, we're still purple. Now, that pendulum swings back and forth. I mean, there was a time, went for Obama in presidential elections twice, but then it went back the other way. And you know why? No party voters. No party voters are the swing voters. That one of the things that's, I don't know how unique it is, but it's neat as far as I'm concerned about Iowa, is that our parties are pretty much evenly divided between Republicans, Democrats, and no party voters. Well, some of you may be aware that we've got a Libertarian Party that got official status after 2022, but I'll put them in with the no party voters for the most part. So up until 2020, no party voters were the most numerous, more than Democrats, more than Republicans. And basically, they're the ones that decide the elections, the statewide elections in particular, but usually the ones at the local level as well. 2020 was a big difference. It was a big change because of sending out the primary, sending out absentee ballots to everybody, basically allowed a lot of no party voters to say, oh, I'll go ahead and vote for the Democrats or the Republicans. And so that changed their party registration. I think a lot of no party voters weren't aware of that, but it happened. And so it dropped down that no party voters were below both Republicans and Democrats, but they've been building back up. And in fact, with the latest monthly voter registration statistics, no party voters are again ahead of Democrats, who've fallen back a little bit. Republicans seem to be ascendant at this time. But that'll probably change. And when I've got statistics, and this is where I would have my PowerPoints, all kinds of lines and drawings and all that sort of stuff. But basically, you'll see where for Republicans and Democrats, the lines go up and down. And for no party voters, generally it keeps going up. They have a lower turnout rate, so more of them become inactive and drop off the rolls at a certain point. So they have more jagged ups and downs. But basically, they're the folks that aren't tied to a party. They're more willing to vote on kitchen table issues, is how we usually describe it. Jobs, the economy, healthcare, whatever it happens to be, rather than this political infighting. We don't care about that stuff. We talked before about the J6 committee. They don't care. Vote for a budget, get me some help, whatever it happens to be. So they'll go one side or the other, depending on who's making the better argument. Well, right now, apparently Republicans are making the better argument because more of them seem to be voting for the Republicans. But at some point later, it's going to shift back for Democrats. So at least right now, I'd say that, yes, we're tending to the red side a little bit, but I still think that we're a swing state and potentially continue to be in the future.
I just want to make a quick comment. I think this is true. I think in fact that Iowa went for Clinton twice, then for Gore against Bush, and then for Bush once in 2004, then for Obama twice. So there's a 30-year history of really a strong Democratic trend, at least in the presidential election, with one exception, with Bush once until Trump.
Okay, I have to go back. I haven't looked
I think
at
that's-
Clinton. I think you're right. No, I think you're right there. And certainly I know it's true from 2000 on when I started paying a little bit closer attention to this, that Gore, then Bush, then Obama twice and so forth. So yeah, absolutely. Well, I see where.
So this, going back to the question of the press and the role of the press, do you make a distinction between disinformation and misinformation? And what do you think of the press's role in parsing those out, parsing the difference of those?
I think we have to be careful about that. I'm a little concerned, again, I'm four square behind free speech kind of a thing. And I think too much we have people throwing these terms around because they have a negative connotation. And it's not so much that anything is not true, it's that it's characterized in a way that maybe there's a spin on it, or you just disagree with it. And that's the worst one, is that, well, I disagree with this, so that must be misinformation or disinformation or something like that. Certainly that stuff happens. You get stuff, people put out information that's false in some way. I guess maybe you shouldn't call it information, lies, basically. And that's unfortunate, and it's part of a free society, unfortunately. But we do, as you suggested, have to be vigilant about it. And the press has to be careful. One of the things I know a lot of people complain about is fact checkers sometimes are not really checking facts. They're checking opinions and complaining about that kind of a thing. So again, have to be careful about that stuff.
So I don't suppose that this PPP would allow students that are already at private religious school and they're going to graduate. I happen to have 3. And I don't suppose they would be grandfathered in because they're already at school and going to graduate.
Question about whether the PPP would basically allow people that are already at school to be grandfathered in. I'm not sure about the specifics of a particular program along those lines or what they would or would not do.
Well,
Well, that's it. It looks like
so
so.
thank you so much for